Hour of 10 o'clock's arrived, so I think we'll make a start if we can, please. Bit of silence if we could. So, members, in line with our guidance on the use of social media, I'm happy for anyone attending this live, although I have the right to suspend filming if the need arises. Item 1, apologies for absence. I've got apologies received from Stephen Spence, Ben Carrasco, Liz Bowes, Amanda Boot, who's up a mountain somewhere for charity, which is great, Paul Deach, Stephen Cooksey, Dave Goodwin, and Marsha Molesey. Any others at all? Okay. Thank you. Item 2, minutes. Page 9, may I sign the minutes of the council meeting held on 5th February? Oh, Andrew Posey.
Thank you, Chairman. I couldn't help noticing in the minutes that 4 of the questions that were put to Cabinet members at the last meeting were told that they would get a response outside of the meeting. So I just felt that in the interests of democracy and openness, those responses, whilst they're not strictly part of the minutes, perhaps could be referenced by means of a web link or something, so that people wanting to follow the meeting afterwards, members of the public, would be able to do that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Purvey. I personally think that's a very good idea, and I'll raise that with the officers. Thank you. So may I sign them as a correct record of the meeting, subject to that? Thank you. Item 3, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests, significant personal interests, or prejudicial interests that members wish to make at this point? No? Thank you. So moving to my announcements, which are slightly longer than normal. They're in the agenda, as you can see, and when you can, please take a look at the Chairman and Vice Chairman notice boards situated outside our office, which do provide pictorial information about our recent visits on an updated basis, and also our activities. And speaking of activities, tomorrow at 11 o'clock, I've personally commissioned a Surrey personal trainer to come here to discuss some exercise for anyone interested before each of our full council meetings begin. I hope this will be another useful addition to council efficiency and health. We shall see. Members, I'm also delighted to tell you that the Surrey County Council Analytics Hub has received an iEasy Innovation Award. It's this one here. In the 2019 Public Sector Transformation event. The Analytics Hub is working with Surrey University to develop the use of simulation to evaluate the likely impact of any proposed changes from a full system viewpoint. This will be used to inform commissioning decisions and improve outcomes for looked after children and children with special educational needs and disabilities. I'm pleased that Sara Di Certo, a senior commissioning officer, is here, and I would like to invite her to step forward and receive the award. Thank you. And I also wanted to tell you about Lewis Mead, a Surrey County Council Children's Rights Apprentice. Lewis and his colleagues are all care leavers and have used their own experiences to train Surrey police officers to have total respect for care experienced young people. Yes, the apprentices actually train the police. And last week I attended the National Crime Beat Awards, where they won first prize nationally for this work. So Lewis is here for this award, and I would like to invite him also to step forward and accept it from me. Members, they also had the temerity to win the first prize for the best presentation amongst everybody, but I thought that was a little bit over the top. On to more serious matters. On behalf of the Council, I would like to pass our best wishes to John Orrick, who's currently ill in hospital. And finally, members, I would like to take this opportunity to ask Council to pay respects to a former councillor who's passed away, Mr. Peter Hickman. Peter was a good friend of many of you and was a Residents' Association County Councillor from 2005 to 2017, representing the Dittons Division. He served on the Health Scrutiny Committee, Children and Families Select Committee and Elmbridge Local Committee, and I had the privilege of working regularly with him. I'm not just saying this, he was a dedicated councillor. So I would invite you all to stand for a moment in silent tribute. Thank you, colleagues. Item 5, the Leader's Statement. I call the Leader to make his statement, and may I remind you, members, that you can make comments as well as questions on the statement, and the Leader will respond at the end. Leader.
Mr. Chairman and members, for those of you that have been counting the days, you will know that today marks my 99th day as leader of this county council. Thank you. Just. That leaves me a clear day to achieve my first set of priorities, so what can possibly go wrong? As you might imagine, there have been plenty of challenges during those 99 days, some frustrations, but equally a great deal of progress. I am truly appreciative of the hard work and dedication of officers and members who work tirelessly for our residents as we move towards achieving our 2030 vision for Surrey. An essential part of that vision is that children and young people are safe and feel safe and confident, and there could be no greater priority for any of us in this chamber than turning around our children's services. Mr. Chairman, I believe that during our recent monitoring visit, the first green shoots of recovery were evident. The report touched upon our comprehensive improvement plan, improved culture for learning and thorough and analytical assessments, all of which were sadly lacking in previous inspections. But let's be clear, we still have a long way to go. And in fact, we have already reached the next key milestone as the SEND local area re-inspection is in its second day of a 3-day visit. I hope this process demonstrates how better partnership working, a passion of mine, is also starting to make a difference for children and their families. There will never be a time for complacency, but I am encouraged by the progress made so far, and I'm confident that we have the right member and officer team in place to continue our road to recovery. Our original budget for the year 2018-19 assumed we would need to draw down 21 million from our already depleted reserves. But I'm pleased to say that as a result of our programme of modernisation and improved efficiency, any use of reserves is unlikely to exceed 1.5 million, and more likely than not, we will achieve a balanced budget for the first time in some years. That is also we also need to see any necessary council tax rises in future years be limited and below any government deliverable one. As I announced on day one, Mr. Chairman, another of my priorities as leader is to move this council back within the county boundary and closer to our residents, and borough colleagues for their help and support to ensure that the move goes as smoothly as possible. Work is progressing on the restructuring of our select committees and democratic services area to deliver on my promise that all members will have the opportunity to make a real contribution to the essential work of this council. These new arrangements will be in place for the start of the municipal year in May. Mr. Chairman, I was delighted that last month's Cabinet meeting agreed to the community charity New Spell taking over the running of the Performance Arts Library. There will always be a place for music, drama and culture in our society, and this deal will see the library reinvigorated for the benefit of existing users and, I hope, a new generation. There is in each district or borough, even from town to town, but in all cases would cut across all services and improve outcomes for residents. Every single one of us has a role to play, whether you are a voluntary, community or faith organisation, volunteer, business, philanthropist or resident. We all bring skills, expertise and ideas for how Surrey needs to be a better place. This is all about strong communities where everyone can take some responsibility for making life better. Our district and borough colleagues, as well as our wider partners, will be key to the successful delivery of those outcomes, which is why I have written to all district and borough leaders proposing the creation of a joint forum. These local partnership boards would not only significantly reduce the level of bureaucracy, but also would broaden the remit of local and joint committees by encompassing a wider representation of key partners in a locality. They would be the primary forum for communication with local communities around local issues, along with wider consultations and discussion, a true place-based approach. I very much look forward to progressing this over the coming weeks and months, and we'll be seeing a paper coming to Cabinet next month with more detail. So what will the next 99 days hold? There is the launch of the 25-year countryside strategy, which will ensure that we protect and enhance Surrey's wonderful countryside, leaving it in a better condition for future generations, whilst at the same time supporting the local economy. I look forward to hearing about progress on Councillor Pover's review of community recycling centres and what alternative operating and funding mechanisms are available to us as part of the wider strategy on waste management. We will look carefully at the feedback from the fire and rescue consultation, which we sincerely hope will shift the emphasis more towards working with our communities and businesses to prevent emergencies from occurring, whilst ensuring that when they do, we respond as efficiently as we possibly can. There will also be the launch of the Surrey Health and Wellbeing Strategy, April. This will pull together a number of strands of work and will see us reduce the size of our operational estate, include a plan to ensure no building we own remains empty, and most importantly, a plan to generate revenue wherever possible from that estate to be used to support our frontline services. A real example of that part of that strategy is the opening next month of the new Hawley Library, which will deliver our vision of libraries being a space for everyone to learn, access information, acquire new skills, whilst also being a focal point for community engagement. The Cabinet updates to Council reflect the breadth of activity across all of the service areas as we move forward with our transformation plans with increasing pace. With a drive towards getting the right people in the right place, a culture that delivers continuing improvement and a transparency in our key priorities, I think we can allow ourselves a degree of optimism as we move along that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader, and an electronic copy of this statement will be circulated following the meeting. Mr. Botton.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Leader, for your optimistic and helpful summary of progress so far, which is duly noted. It seems to me that there are a number of challenges which we continue to face, however, with limited opportunity for us as ordinary members to contribute to the development of policy and strategy. And so I would ask that when you complete your review of scrutiny, you consider how we, as ordinary members, can contribute to the formation of policy and can constructively propose a future for the Council and its services, which adequately reflects the needs and desires of our residents. I'm grateful to Mr. O'Reilly for his work on this and bringing us together, but a number of the themes that have emerged from that are such as I have articulated. A further issue I need to raise as a matter of concern. It seems to me that the critical inspection report into our fire and rescue service, which was published just before Christmas, has not properly received a debate, either in this chamber or anywhere else. Now, that is a matter of concern for me, not because I have a view, but because I don't, and because it's too important for us to grandstand and make political commentary about without knowing what we're talking about. The consultation looking at the future of our fire and rescue service, the controversial changes to the night cover in some areas, which is referred to in Mr. Evans' question, are a matter of concern to residents, but I can't get involved and I can't understand and I can't explain to residents if I don't have the opportunity for a proper debate. And it seems to me that there are a number of areas of the work of our council which would benefit hugely from a more transparent and more open approach, particularly when we are facing criticism. I welcome hugely the rigour and impatience which characterises our improvement work on our children's services, and I look forward, when we discuss the Children's Health and Wellbeing Strategy, to articulating how I would hope that that impatience would translate itself into proper mental health services for our children. I welcome the place-based approach, and I hugely welcome the partnerships that the leader is proposing with our boroughs and districts. As a twin hatter for many years, I hugely appreciate what our boroughs and districts can bring to us. It seems to me, however, that there is a fundamental change necessary there, because currently members of the public who attend our local or joint committees see us discuss highways issues to which highways generally say no. And the whole experience from residents' perspective, as well indeed as from the point of view of our borough and district colleagues, is negative. I welcome the ambitions to turn that on its head, but something fundamental has got to change to make those meetings and those engagements positive, both for residents and members. I welcome a commitment that we will be leaving no building we own empty. As I have said in the past, the empty buildings with our badge on the outside stand as a symbol of our past inaction and ineptitude. I welcome the impact that you were proposing to have on that. And finally, I welcome, obviously, your commentary, Leader, about the budget. For me, the importance of what we do here is to monitor the impacts of the savings, the impacts of the cuts, and to ensure that every child and every family in this county gets what they are entitled to and what they need. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bottom. Mr. Harrison.
Thank you, Chairman, and congratulations on the 99 days. I hadn't realised it was so close. I've really just got 2 points, well, 1 point and a question I want to raise today. In relation to, and supporting Mr. Bottom in relation to the backbenchers' role, there's been a lot of discussion about select and scrutiny committees. I will say, with a fewer number of committees, and given the proportionality, that could represent less opportunity for backbenchers as a whole and opposition councillors in particular. And I would say that we are ready, willing and able to contribute fully to that, given the opportunity. Congratulations on the numbers. They seem to be coming very good, and thank you to the officers who've implemented that and the oversight that you've given to it. Also welcome the fact that you think we can have council tax below future capping limits. That would be welcome to many residents. Clearly, government is very involved with matters in Europe at the moment, but the fair funding review, I would appreciate if you could tell us your views on that, what the Council's response has been on that, because no doubt attention will come back to that once the European matters have been moved further down the road. I don't think there's been enough intelligence or sharing of the Council's view on that very important matter. So if you can enlighten us on that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bennison.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Congratulate you on this speech. It was very enlightening, and this is only a small part. With reference to, I think we've got 44 buildings, and we will be moving from here, which is a shame in my mind anyway, because at the moment, and short term, there will be a dispersal of officers, and we don't know what the situation will be. What is your impression of telecommunicating or teleconferencing? And it's as simple as that. If I don't understand, I'll come back to you and mention it. But it should be very good from vehicle emissions, because we won't all have to drive from all over the place to get there. Yesterday we had nearly 9 officers at our meeting. Don't know why or where they'd all come from. And there may be no car parking in the new facility, so it might work very well.
Mr. Robert Evans.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Leader, for your remarks. And if I can make a cricketing analogy, if you start the day and you get to 99, you're rather pleased with yourself, but you certainly don't want to get out at that stage. Many members of this Council, and I know members of the public, will welcome your initiative in looking at Surrey County Council having a home within the current boundaries of the county. But in your efforts to reduce cost and streamline democracy in Surrey, have you looked at the examples of other councils up and down the country, from Cornwall to Oxford, Berkshire to Northamptonshire, and plenty others, where they're moving away from the structure of 2-tier councils and moving towards unitary authorities as a more efficient way of serving the people we represent, and more efficient use of resources and better democracy? Thank you.
Mr. Kington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And can I just say how nice the pictures look at the top of the stairs as we come in. I think you might have had something to do with that. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the tone of Councillor Oliver is much different to what we have been used to in the past, and that's very much welcomed. However, the underlying message remains the same, which is that we, Surrey County Council, have a plan, and we would like the others to join it, and that we, Surrey County Council, has a vision, and we'd like to make sure the others help us to deliver it. The underlying concern is that actually, once again, Surrey is developing this, you will do as we require, and we will ensure our issues become the highest priority. I am sure that is not what Councillor Oliver has intended, but there are those people out there who remain extremely suspicious that every time Surrey talks of partnership, it's about serving Surrey's interests. So I would like him to reassure all of those who still feel that this is about genuine partnership, that the priorities and the needs of those that are being partnered with are also going to be taken into consideration. And in fact, there is an element where there can be differences in how these things are developed across the county. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Chairman. My first remark is no surprise, I think, to associate myself completely with what Mr. Botten and Mr. Harrison said about scrutiny, and I think and the leader himself, I think there's a common consensus that, come May, things have got to change, and they've got to change fundamentally. Chairman, the point I'd like to raise, and as other members have from Councillor Oliver's statement about partnerships at all levels, but at local level. It just seemed to me 9 years ago since the word localism appeared in the political lexicon, suddenly to disappear. And I hope, and I'm reasonably confident, that the strategy, the ideas that Councillor Oliver, Mr. Oliver has enunciated will mean a reaffirmation and a new boost to serious, genuine localism. Only point I would raise, and it falls into teach your grandmother to suck eggs, as we look to new structures, and I appreciate there is no structure in place at the moment. There's a lot of thought, lots of consultation to take place as we go on this journey. The point I'd like to make is, whereas for all their deficiencies, and there are many, for local and joint committees, they do take decisions. Often, as Mr. Botton said, officers say no, 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 but ultimately the local and joint committees do take decisions. And our hope is, and I'm sure I'm going to be pleasantly answered by Mr. Oliver when he responds, is that the new format, whatever it is, that brings more people in, brings more communities in, brings representatives from civic societies, we call it, into this process. Councillor Oliver, as Mr. Oliver mentioned, communications and consultations, and absolutely, that's essential. But we mustn't lose the ability, ultimately, to make decisions, because otherwise, there is always a danger. If you bring people together, it becomes a talking shop. And that is something we don't want. I'm sure Councillor Oliver doesn't want. We want a much more involvement in this process, but it must also not take away the ability to decide at local level.
Mrs. White.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, I just have a very brief and I hope fairly simple question for the leader. It's to do with the place-based approach and the partnership forum that he was talking about. I wonder if I could just have confirmation that that will meet in public and that members of the public will have an opportunity to hear the discussions and the decisions. And the reason I ask this is because Guildford actually has had a similar process for quite a long time. It used to meet in public, and then for some reason a previous leader of Guildford Borough Council decided to move it so that it would meet in private. That was a great loss, and I sincerely hope that his new proposal will redress that. Thank you, Chairman.
Before the leader responds, final question from Dr. Povey.
Thank you, Chairman. I was very pleased to hear what the leader said about council tax, and I wanted to just pick up on what Mr. Harrison said about wondering what lobbying discussions the leader had around fairer funding. I wanted to go a step further because fairer funding just redistributes the funding between councils, and that can be very difficult for national government because it means some are losers. So I think what the lobbying needs to be on as well is the comprehensive spending review, because that decides on the total quantum of money available for local government. So we need that to go up, and then it makes it easier for the government to redistribute money towards us.
And I've just seen Mr. Hussain.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Leader, for mentioning the fire and rescue consultation. Thank you to Mr. Bottomley for bringing it up as well. I'm the chairman of the working group, and I would love an input from any member on the subject. It's a very important matter, as you said, but anybody who wants to contribute, please be free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Leader, would you care to respond?
Thank you, Chairman. So I'll try and pick up all of the points. There are some themes in this, but I'll cover as many as I have noted. So in terms of contribution and engagement in policy, absolutely, that is about how, and that's been the discussion about how we can ensure that happens through the revised scrutiny process and task and finish groups. I don't know there's any other mechanism for achieving that. It is too late to discuss policy by the time it comes to this council, so it has to be put in earlier in the process. So I think with the work that John O'Reilly and which has been a cross-party group, I believe that the recommendations, when those come through, will address that point and will facilitate that early engagement. On the fire and rescue, there is a member reference group that met last week, and indeed there will be a member briefing in April. So I would hope that the members would take the opportunity to look at the work of the reference group and also to attend that member briefing and I hope that they will then get some reassurance that the improvement plan that is now in place and is moving along does absolutely address the main issues that came out of the inspection report. I think that the main issue related to prevention. That was where the focus needed to be more on prevention. It certainly wasn't about there being any risk to residents. And I think to Nick Harrison's point, I think the scrutiny point John O'Reilly hopefully has picked up as well. On the fair funding review, the County Council Network have done a lot of work with support from other organisations to model the impact of that. If the consultation as published, if that were to be implemented, what that would mean for county councils. In general terms, it's positive news. As always, Surrey doesn't necessarily fit the mould, and there are some issues for us caused really by the sort of the one-off damping effects over the years. So the core base, if you looked at the detail, effectively there's a sort of core element of funding that will go across all councils, and then there will be 7 specific areas that will be picked up, including the funding of children and adult services and so on. Our focus has been working with the CCN to look at those 7 areas, because it's key for us that we get the right funding formula in place, particularly for our children's and adult services. There have been some meetings with senior members of the Surrey MPs, and they're aware of our concerns, and indeed we have given them some suggestions as to how any proposals might be more equitable from a Surrey perspective. So those conversations will continue, and we'll see what happens when the Minister publishes the results of the consultation. On the spending review, I mean, I think that depends entirely upon what happens with Brexit. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has said publicly that there are significant sums, a significant cash mountain that he is sitting on, and if we all behave and we exit Brexit in an orderly way, although that decision now seems to be down to the Speaker of the House rather than anybody else, then we can expect to benefit from that. So, again, we have put in our pitch, if you like, to receive a fair funding from those sums. To Mike Benison's point, we have a Skype facility at the moment, which I suspect is rather underutilised. I don't think any of us in the member group that looks at IT and other things, I think continually finds issues with both the software, the hardware that we use. A key part of the exiting from this building will be to get agile working in place and a proper digital process. So it is absolutely the hope that we will use far more, as you put it, teleconferencing, but ways of communicating, not necessarily face-to-face. So there is a whole piece of stream of work around that digital and agile working, which will focus most certainly on that, and indeed on making our IT network rather more robust. To Robert Evans' point, yes, this is about moving closer to our residents. It isn't about creating unitary authorities. I mean, it will be an interesting challenge just to see what's happened if that were to be put to the district and boroughs. My understanding is that James Brokenshire has said that for any authorities, two-tier authorities that want to become unitary authorities, it needs the agreement of all of those authorities. So that's all 12. So we'll see what Epsom and you will have to say about that. But in terms of the joint vision and partnership working, I mean, I can only say these things, and I think I have to say these things many, many, many times to get across my point. This is, I have put my hands up on previous meetings to say that the county has had an arrogance about it in terms of the way in which it's approached it. We are actively engaging. All of those of you that are twin houses will know, I hope, that there are active conversations at all levels with district and boroughs about officer and members. And this is genuinely about doing this in partnership. I cannot reinforce the point more than I have done, which is that we accept that we cannot do it on our own and should not do it on our own. So to that extent, to the point that Eva Kington had made, John O'Reilly and Fiona White, yes, we're not going to tell the districts and boroughs whether these should be public meetings. We're not going to tell the districts and boroughs how those should be constituted. We're going to have a conversation with them, which we've now started, in terms of what they want, how they think it would be most efficiently set up. My own view is that we could look at as a guideline the newly constituted Health and Wellbeing Board, which is a public services board, which includes representations from the CCGs, from acute hospitals, from the university, from the LEP, and so on, from residents and from charities. So all the people that are engaged at that front line in our local communities should have a voice at that table. They shouldn't be just a discussion shop. They should be a decision-making forum. But I'm not going to go out and tell the districts and boroughs or anybody else what that looks like. What I am going to do is ask for their views, and I hope that out of that collectively, when it comes back to this council for approval, we will have found a formula that addresses those very real issues and the very real desire to create proper, effective joint working. And I think, Mr. Chairman, I hope that's picked up most of the points that were raised.
Thank you, Leader. Item 6, members' question time. Notice of 7 questions. 5 minutes per question for supplementary questions, must be phrased as questions, not statements, and be relevant to the original question. Question time is limited to 45 minutes, at which point I will finish the question we're on and close the item if necessary. Any questions not covered during the 45 minutes can be followed up elsewhere outside the meeting, and there will be an additional 15 minutes for members to ask questions of Cabinet members based on the previously circulated Cabinet member briefings that you all have. These will be taken on a first-come, first-served basis, and there will be no supplementaries. So if you can start with question 1. Mrs. Thompson, do you have a supplementary? No. Question 2. Sorry? Does anyone else have a supplementary? Thank you. Moving on to question 2. Jonathan Essex. No supplementary. Anybody else? Thank you. Question 3. Mr. Robert Evans. No supplementary. Excellent. We do. Mr. Mallet.
Thank you. I would just like the Cabinet member to comment on the last sentence he makes of the first paragraph. I would ask, where can he point me to any document or other information which now gives the position on the Heathrow environmental and surface access issues? Because it's pointed out here that these are satisfactorily addressed. I'm not quite sure whether that means will be satisfactorily addressed or are, but if they are, can you point me please to where the document that shows how the local access issues in particular are going to be satisfied? Thank you.
Any other questions before Mr. Goodman responds? Mr. Goodman.
Yes, thank you for the supplementary. Heathrow continues to be a real challenge for us. I work very closely with the Heathrow Strategic Group in their meeting here this week, and we go through all the issues pertaining to Heathrow. And the issue of the environment changes all the time, things are added to it. What I will say to you is that I will make sure you have the latest information that we're working to. I'm very pleased with the work that we do in this council, especially with Sue Janota, who works very closely with Heathrow Strategic Group to make sure we have the right environmental issues. What I would say to you is this will take some time in terms of what's going to happen, because we are waiting for Heathrow to finish their consultation, which they did 2 weeks ago, and they will then tell us what the noise and other impacts are with their revised routes. And so that will also come into this, but I will give you the most up-to-date environmental issues sometime this week.
Thank you. Question 4, Mr. Mallet. Do you have a supplementary? Anybody else? Thank you. Moving on, question 5, Mrs. White.
Sorry, Chairman. Yes, I do have a supplementary. Can I first of all thank the Cabinet Member for her response? I just have one supplementary question. And I have to say I'm a bit disappointed in the paragraph that says staff are being encouraged to take part in the consultation, because I had hoped that they would have had input right from the very beginning on this. So please could she confirm that staff's views will be given additional weight when the consultation responses are considered, to take into account their knowledge and experience of the service, which we as councillors and maybe members of the public don't necessarily have. Thank you, Chairman.
Anyone else? Mrs. Turner-Stewart.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's important to state that we take the consultation with our staff very seriously. The reason for asking them to contribute to the wider consultation is to make sure, as the consultation progresses, that we capture all the views as they're developed. So fire and rescue staff do an outstanding job. We understand that it is important that our staff are heard during this time of proposed change and also opportunity. We're conducting extensive and exhaustive staff engagement where all of our firefighters will be able to share their views and we can reassure them of our intentions. Sessions have been running for several weeks and we've generally found our staff to recognise the rationale and value in our proposals. We absolutely value the contribution and dedication of our committed staff and want to enable them to shape our proposals before they are finalised in September of this year. Our staff are at the centre of everything we do. Here are just some of the positive actions we have taken recently. We started our joint recruits course with East and West Sussex in January and have 12 recruits on this course, in addition to our inter-service transfers and on-call whole-time conversions, providing a 10% uplift. Our 4 new Rosenbauer fire engines with greater crew safety features and a massive uplift in operational capability are starting operational life at our fire stations. Our Surrey 999 call centre, as the leaders mentioned, will become a joint Surrey and West Sussex control centre by December 2019. And we have upgraded our training facilities at Ray Park with 2 new state-of-the-art hot fire training facilities. And we have introduced service mental health champions and have some of the highest standards of occupational health and welfare in the UK. So I hope that will give you some understanding of the importance we place on our staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Question 6, Mrs. Watson. Anyone else with a supplementary? Yes, Mr. Townsend.
I'd like to understand what the Cabinet Member means by maximising the potential of the youth centre buildings wherever possible. That's a very, very broad phrase that doesn't really answer the question. And I do think it's
Thank you. Mr. Essex.
Thank you. And thank you for the reply, but it's not my question. Would the Cabinet Member agree with me that at least some of the gaps referred to in the reply are as a direct result of our halving the number of youth workers across Surrey in the last year or two to what now operates as a skeleton service in most boroughs, with just 1 youth worker operating full-time, fully qualified in each borough and district, and that to address this we may need to reverse some of those reductions in youth work provision and reinstate the number of youth workers we have operating across Surrey?
And Mr. Robert Evans.
Thank you very much. And I'm a former teacher and youth worker, as colleagues will know. And following on from Councillor Essex's remarks, does the Cabinet Member share my concern and colleagues about the possible reduction in the youth service in an age when we are all rightly worried about young people possibly becoming radicalised, and when the horrors of knife crime and drug use are on our borders, if not within the county area? Is she aware of the real anxiety in the community that cuts to this service could be really negative and have a damaging effect on our towns and villages. That's a concern. Thank you.
Mrs. Curran.
Chairman, thank you. In Bookham we are very fortunate to have the Bookham Youth and Community Centre, which was handed over to the community to run on its behalf a few years ago, and I think, Chairman, that you know the history of that. We do not have any Surrey youth work going on in Bookham for the time being, but we have an extremely effective youth service which is provided by our community in the Bookham Youth and Community Centre. And could I urge the Cabinet Member to look with her colleagues at the plans for re-providing that centre, which have been on the books for a very long time and are of huge importance in our place shaping of the Bookham community. We really want to ensure that we can continue to give a really excellent community-based youth service to the people of Bookham and Fetcham, and any encouragement I can have to the Cabinet to move that project on at pace would be very welcome.
Thank you. And Mrs. Mason.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, you know where my heart is and my feelings are about this youth service and what's been or not been now provided. What we haven't done successfully, I feel. I can understand we need to make savings, but if you have an area which is recognised as having high deprivation, which is my division, where
Mrs.
you
Mason,
have,
what's your question?
The question
please?
is, have they fully understood, and I don't think they have, the implications to areas of high deprivation by withdrawing youth services and just dealing with targeting a family? I'm so concerned. Thank you.
Mrs. Lewis.
Thank you, Chairman. Quite a range of comments and questions there for me. As I think colleagues will recognise, my instinct normally in answering questions, and I had two earlier questions, was to give as much information as possible. But when there is a review in progress, it's a little bit difficult to give the results of that review in an answer. So I do understand it felt a little unsatisfactory for that reason. So this is very much a work in progress, but we're reviewing the youth offer. And what we've been discussing here, probably because of the age profile of all of us, and because of our understanding up to now, is about what Surrey can provide, Surrey County Council can provide, and how they can provide it in the way that we've provided it since the 1950s. And any review of the youth offer has got to start first and foremost with what young people today want to get out of that offer. So the first principle that's being used in the review is to shape it around the things that young people tell us that they value and would use. Secondly, the review of the youth offer is very much in the spirit of what the leader has described up to now. It's a partnership review. It's not all about what the county council's going to do. It's what we're going to do with our colleagues in the districts and boroughs and in the voluntary community and faith sector. So today, for example, there's a meeting taking place in Epsom, which is representatives of all the districts and boroughs and the police and our officers coming together to map out where there are hotspots, where there are places where we don't currently feel there is provision and where we need to do things a bit differently. There's also a meeting on the 1st of April in Epsom specifically that is going to be a meeting of the voluntary community and faith sector, looking at, in the example of the Edge Youth Centre, which Mrs Mason raised at the last council meeting, about where the voluntary community and faith sector might want to work together to make a provision there. And I know there's so much going on that members will want to have their say on this as well. So on the 16th of April, the electronic invitations will be in your inboxes by tomorrow. There's going to be a drop-in session where you can come and talk to officers about particular issues with the youth offer in your area. And obviously you're very welcome to write to me any time about that as well. I will take Mrs Mason's example as a case in point, because in her division there is an old-style youth centre called the Edge, And when I look back at the history of what has happened at the Edge, it has been very stop-start and disappointing. I can understand as a local member, particularly in an area where there are significant issues that young people, challenges that young people are having to face. It hasn't been good, but it hasn't been for the want of trying. A lot of different initiatives have been stopped and started there. The last of them in the autumn, which was an initiative for young women, I understand, and it was closed because it was so poorly attended. That was one in the autumn of last year. So I think it comes back to this point. We need to find ways of delivering this youth work in ways that fit in with each local community, that responds to the needs of young people there and to the things that they'll actually be interested in being involved in. And that's what's in progress at the moment. So I hope that answers some of the points that were made. The specific issue of radicalisation and knife crime, the first question today did come into that area, and I think the answer there was more comprehensive. When there is a need for targeted work for particular groups of young people, this is an area for the County Council to be involved in. And you can see there the particular work, the targeted work that is being commissioned to target young people who are at risk of radicalisation and knife crime. And that was discussed with all our partners yesterday in great detail at the Safeguarding Children's Board. We have to know our place. As Tim Oliver said, there's some humility in that. We have to know what we can do, what we can commission and what we can do well. And that's what we can do. When we can't do things well, when they need a different offer for different districts and boroughs, we need to work with our partners to find the right solutions for the different areas, and we won't always be the lead on that. So I hope you can see the balance between the answers to question 1 and what we're trying to do in reviewing the youth offer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. And before we move on to question 7, I'd just like to point out that it is indeed World Social Work Day, and Surrey County Council are running some celebratory events, and I take the opportunity of thanking and acknowledging the hard work of all of our social workers, and would be really pleased if you would too. Thank you, members. And moving to question 7, Mr. Robert Evans, do you have a supplementary?
Thank you very much, Chair. And can I thank the Cabinet member for her response. And I welcome the fire prevention details in this document. But does she share my concern that reducing the fire cover from many of the fire stations in Surrey, cutting the service at night time, will inevitably mean some increase in response time, which will endanger citizens? This document often says about keeping Surrey safe, which we all share. It doesn't say anything, to my mind, about making Surrey safer. And if I can give an example, may I give an example of my concern? The school of which I'm chair of the governors had told me that the local fire service, the local fire station, is not now responding when the fire alarm goes off after too many false alarms. They're not going to respond, which means that should the fire alarm go off in the night, there will be a very lengthy delay before the fire service arrives. And while she's on her feet, could the Cabinet member tell me when the new Fordbridge fire station is going to open and how much it's cost? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think we need to question the suggestion that a school would not be attended to if a fire alarm went off. We have a very effective call challenge procedure which enables us to identify if there is a false alarm, because obviously we have many false alarms to attend and there is a huge resource and drain on our resources to undertake that. So that would be a valid exercise to carry out, but I certainly refute the fact that we would refuse to attend. With regard to Fordbridge Fire Station, the station will be opening at the end of April, early May, but there are still some last-minute tweaks in terms of utilities connection. So the final cost, overall cost, can be reported to you once that opening date has commenced, because at the moment we're still finalising some of the last finishing touches. In terms of your concern around attendance times, There is a huge amount of mitigation work that's underway to reduce any impact that these proposals may have, albeit very small. There are some increases in our ability to attend, efficiencies in attendance times at the weekend, so it balances out very well, and the mitigation should actually improve response times overall. Our proposals are based on realigning our resources against the risks in Surrey, and we'll be delivering life-saving community prevention and protection work, also focusing on road traffic, water and fire safety for our workplaces and homes. So Her Majesty's Inspector has recently said that we must satisfy ourselves that our fire and rescue services are the most productive and the best value for money. And the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government are asking, do we have the skills and capabilities in our workforce to do this work? So by transferring capacity from night time when the risk is lower to daytime when we are able to enable our firefighters to undertake essential prevention and protection activity, our communities will be better protected and safer if we do all we can to prevent emergencies from happening in the first place rather than responding when they do. The impact of a house fire can be devastating, which is why we must undertake much more prevention work that will prevent emergencies happening in the first place. This is particularly important for people with mobility issues, other disabilities or vulnerabilities. We have a huge ageing population, which is why prevention activity is so vitally important. So we're working to reduce response times with a series of measures. We have a pre-alert which enables our control room operators during an emergency call to notify that a response may be required, enabling staff to prepare in advance and saving valuable time. Reduced turnout times have been achieved by the service during waking hours of 0700 to midnight from 120 to 75 seconds. An auto on scene used by the National Ambulance Service enables crews to find locations more easily, especially where members of the public are having difficulty in explaining where they are. So I hope that will give you some assurance, Councillor Evans, as to the measures that we're taking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs Turner-Stewart. Now, are there any questions on the Cabinet Member updates? And if so, please indicate to whom you're addressing the question. Yes, Mrs Curran.
I have a question for Mr Goodman, the Cabinet Member for Environment and Waste. And may I ask him to pass on thanks from residents in my division for the hard work that he and his team put in around the time of the collapse of buses, etc., last week. In particular, from Bookham and Fetcham, for the work that was done to find a replacement operator for the 479 service.
Yes, Mr Goodman.
Yes, thank you for that question. What I will pass on your thanks to the service, and I think it's worth noting that at 10 o'clock last Monday, we were told that all the buses were being returned to base. So we had no ways of getting children home from school, but by lunchtime, we were able to get every child home from school, and by the Tuesday, all but one route was covered, and by Friday, we had all routes covered. However, all those previous routes were commercial routes, so we've had to make a decision that we've had to pay extra money to ensure we keep these routes going from now to the 30th of July. During that time, we will be looking at the bus service and seeing what we can do to extend it, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done with the bus service to see if we can get some commerciality back to those routes. And it would be wrong for me to commit long-term on it, but we are working really hard on these routes.
Thank you, Mr Goodman. Mr Hall.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I also join Mrs Curran in thanking the Cabinet members and his team for their efforts on the etc. buses? Could I ask what lessons we've learnt from this?
Mr Goodman.
Again, that was a question that was asked to me on radio, but we've got to understand that these were commercial routes. These were not our routes that we were paying. So I think if there's any lesson to learn, perhaps we just need to spend some time looking at the people that are doing commercial routes to make sure that they have a safe business plan, and I'm sure the service will take that up.
Mr Witham.
Thank you, Chairman. A comment, if I may, for the Cabinet Member for Community Services relating to the fire service review. I was told by both the current Chief Fire Officer and his predecessor that over the last 10 years the number of fires in Surrey has reduced by 50%, which was a staggering figure. but at the same time, the number of road traffic accidents in Surrey has increased by 50%. And that there are more people who die every year in our rivers through drowning than die in road traffic accidents. And for the benefit of Mr. Bottom, when I have explained that to my residents, as I did at a meeting last night, they understand that any service has to look at what it provides, how it provides it, where the emergencies are likely to arise.
Mr. Witham, what's your question, please?
It wasn't. I said it was a comment. And therefore, I would ask the cabinet. I will ask the cabinet member, Chairman, at your request, to bear all of that in mind and try and put that bit of information out into the public domain more, so that all of us actually understand the dangers and the risks that the fire service and the rescue service are having to contend with, and the changes involved. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. I briefly stand as an independent. I want everybody to know that, because there are members of the community in the Conservative Party that think I'm not. I was actually insulted by one yesterday by being told I was something else. My thanks are, though, to the Cabinet member, and I reinforce the 479 issue. Ashford is very, very pleased that bus service has been reinstated. I think Mr. Hall's question was a very apposite one. You know, what lessons are going to be learned? We really do need to learn that when we actually have contracts, we know that that company can actually deliver. Thank you.
At least Mr. Hall asked a question. The last two were statements, so I'm not going to put up with it in future. Thank you. Mrs. White.
I hope I don't test your patience too much, Chairman. I will try to phrase this as a question. Please, could I ask the Cabinet Member for Highways and Transport if he would pass on from me and the residents of Byfield Road in Guildford our very grateful thanks for the Rolls-Royce job of resurfacing that was carried out, and for the courtesy and the way in which the workforce actually did that work. The residents are incredibly impressed. I stood there when the road was opened and couldn't even hear cars driving along it. So thank you. Please pass on. It's probably the first and last time I'm going to be this gracious to you. But on the other hand, it is very appropriate. Please, would you pass that on? Thank you, Chairman. I hope I didn't stretch it too much.
No, you very well. Yes, indeed you were.
Yes, I have a question in the first paragraph of the adult and health Cabinet member's statement. But just first, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank the Cabinet member for finally putting some clarification in the one to the third paragraph on the 2,700 units, because I have to say to you that in seminars and in statements up to now, it was first 2,000 units, then it was 700 units, then it was back to 2,000. So there's not previously been a clarity in terms of what is 2,000 and what is 700, and now it is clearly stated there, so we can see where we are. Thank you. Now, my question, on the first paragraph, it says the savings have been achieved mostly in older people's services, and I would like to ask, can you put some real situation on these savings? Have they been achieved by reduction in the threshold at which services can be obtained? And what about the situation to do with the actual care packages? Because the coalition of disabled people are very upset about their members receiving less and less care and disability grants. So how much of the saving of £21.3 million, what sort of percentage of that is being achieved by cuts in grants, and by altering the threshold at which the actual care services are being received. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Mooney.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Councillor Malik, for your question. Thank you also for the feedback on accommodation, care and support. In response, I would say to you that the savings have been achieved through a reduction in the numbers of people receiving services, and also, in particular, those in residential and in nursing care, and by keeping inflationary increases in the cost of care to a minimum. If you would like some further clarity, you mentioned percentages, I can obtain that for you and provide that information to you after this meeting. I'm also picking up on your point in regards to the Coalition of Disabled People. I do meet with the Coalition on a regular basis and have those meetings set up moving forwards for every 3 months. And I would welcome, if there are any cases of concern, please do bring those to my attention and I can investigate and look into those further and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kington.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Councillor Goodman for his statement on Heathrow. The Secretary of State of Transport's commitment to a third runway has led to consultation proposals for a major increase in the number of planes flying over Epsom and Newell at a much lower height. However, our local MP in Epsom Newell has said that he's not aware of any proposals to increase flights over Epsom and Newell. As you know, many of us on this site value Councillor Goodman's judgment on so many of the environmental issues that we face. So can he advise me and the residents of Epsom Newell that on the matter of flight paths, who should we believe, the Secretary of State for Transport or the MP for Epsom and Newell?
Mr. Goodman.
Yes, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Look, Heathrow have just finished their consultation 2 weeks ago. No decision or final consultation has been conducted yet. They've got to put all that consultation into some formula to decide which are going to be the preferred routes. What will then happen is next year, 2020, then the public then will get the chance to be consulted again on the preferred routes by Heathrow. So there is no decision yet being made.
Thank you. Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I sang at a very successful concert on last Saturday evening, to a very large audience, including the Lord Lieutenant, and we were using music provided by the Surrey Performing Arts Library. Might I ask Mrs. Isles, our Cabinet Member for All Age Learning, to extend the thanks of many musicians across the county for the opportunity to continue to use music from the really valuable collection which is part of the Surrey Performing Arts Library. It's great that we now have an opportunity to continue to have access to that really valuable collection, and it is now in the hands of an organisation which I believe will preserve it and enhance it and enable it to be used for future generations for the benefit of all of those who enjoy music and other cultural activities in this county. Thank you.
Mrs. Isles.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. We're all delighted that that did go through Cabinet. There was actually a round of applause at the meeting, which I think is probably a first in my experience anyway, and a very good example of partnership working with stakeholders and users who really value that collection. What we now need to do is make sure that their business case is sustainable and that we're working with them before we transition it as a whole, because we do recognise the value of keeping that safe.
Mrs. Mason.
Thank you. This is a question for Councillor Mary Lewis. It's regarding about the fourth paragraph down about the youth offer, and it's saying it's going to be carrying out a review, fine, and we're going to be, I think the word is they're going to be talking with people, I think that's what she said, we're going to be making discussions, etc., with youth to see what they want, etc. But what I need to say to you all is that, Councillor Lewis, but the statement you made about not much happening, therefore nothing, it was simply the restructuring of the youth service last summer that led to our office, two important officers coming away from Surrey, and it left Epsom and York Borough with 1 full-time staff and 2 part-timers to run the Focus and the Edge. And the outcome to that, and that's why I'm saying it here, is that nothing could be provided at the Edge.
And your question, please, Mrs. Mason?
I was just going to say, who, if she is going to discuss what these young people need, because a lot of those people aren't meeting anywhere, so nothing's happening. So how we get, other than, I love it when we say proper social workers or proper youth workers, how are we going to ask the youngsters where there isn't any provision at all at the moment? Thank you.
Mrs. Lewis.
Thank you. I do recognise that the future of the Youth Centre, the Edge, is of great interest to all members in the area. I've had representations not only from Mrs Mason but also from Mrs Muir and from Mrs Mountain asking about what has been telling me about what has been happening and asking me about what is going to happen. And I really would refer to the comments I made in answer to the previous question, that we're working with districts and borough colleagues, and we have a continual range of engagement with children and young people, because that's one of the priorities on the Ofsted Priority Action Plan. We were told in the Ofsted report we weren't asking children enough and young people about their opinions, about the way we deliver services. And there's a whole programme of work on how we do that better and widening out the range of children and young people we speak to. So, Mrs Mason, rest assured it doesn't hinge on an individual Surrey social worker being in the Edge. It's about much wider consultation, possibly with young people that have never been anywhere near a place like the Edge, and finding out what would be the activities that would prevent them from exhibiting antisocial behaviour and the other things that she and her colleagues are worried about. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Harmer.
Thank you, Chairman. This is for Mr. Goodman. A few weeks ago, we had a very helpful, I thought, although rather poorly attended, one of those seminars that we do on the subject of Heathrow expansion. So I'm going back to that. I thought it was helpful. It was to guide us as to how one might respond to the consultation process. Going on to the next stage, which you were commenting on in response to Mr. Kington, can we have an assurance that there will be the opportunity to participate in seeing what the next round of proposals might be in due course, and how's the mechanism for that going to work? Any idea of the timing and or at what stage it would be appropriate for us to have another round?
Mr. Goodman.
Well, actually, we need to go back one stage, because the next stage is in June, the master plan for the third runway. And that's going to be a consultation that will take place in June. And we will be setting up a members group, again as we did last time, for that. When we get to the stage next January and February, but it could be March, April, but when we actually know what the proposals are for the flight pass, then we will have another member group as well with the boroughs and districts. So we will bring Heathrow along to discuss those, because I agree with you, I thought it was very valuable to all members present on what Heathrow's issues were and being able to answer us frankly on what the issues that we had with the consultation.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. That's the end of that item. So we move to item 7, statements by members. No statements have been received. So item 8, original motions. I've received notice of 2 original motions, and the first motion is standing in the name of Mr. Chris Bottom. Under Standing Order 12.3, Council has to decide if it wishes to debate this motion today, and does Council wish to debate the motion now? Thank you. So we will move to Mr. Bottom to move the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the leader also for his helpful suggestions with regard to this motion. I was moved to bring it before us today by the advertisement that I mentioned in the motion for a programme manager to facilitate the move from County Hall with a salary in the mid-90s. And we have to be clear that the optics of this are extremely damaging to this council. Firstly, there are people out there who are spending their lives fighting for special needs packages for their children and coming across all sorts of challenges in that process. And there are people out there using food banks and for whom the council tax increase, which has just been landing on their doorstep, is possibly a step too far. So we have to bear in mind that the County Council needs to get its house in order in respect of employing at a cost-effective way and in a proper and appropriate fashion, and one which our residents can have confidence in. Now, I know that the leader has talked about partnerships, and I think the solution to this is to look at how we can share appointments with our boroughs and districts, how we can grow talent within Surrey as a county, how we can facilitate the growth of an ethos of public service among the Surrey population to take pleasure in joining local government and enriching it. I've spent my whole life in the public sector, and I am firmly committed to the development and quality of the good governance of our public services. So I know that there are plenty of examples up and down the country of where officers have shared posts between boroughs and districts and county, and where that has happened, my belief is that the evidence is that it works well. So I would ask that the county in future moves to a situation where instead of using temporary staff, we use permanent staff, because that's where the embedding of talent and the growth of the workforce should sit. That we look to ensuring that we maximise the use of resources that are already in the local government family by looking where possible to share where resources can be. And that we are mindful of the optics of high salaries for short-term posts, because our families out there, our residents, are very clear that having gone on and on and on about Surrey's lack of money over the last 10 years, it really strikes a discordant note to see salaries of this sort advertised. I know that the future of this county council depends on a strong, committed workforce. And I was delighted when the chairman applauded our social workers earlier, because the valuing of the workforce is important. But as our pay policy indicates, there is a gap between the top and the bottom. And unless we're mindful of managing that gap, we will lose the battle to secure and retain a proper, committed workforce. Chairman, I move this motion. I understand that there is an amendment to come, but I have pleasure in moving the motion as it stands in the order paper in my name.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Mr. Forster, you're seconding the motion?
I would like to second this motion, Chairman, but I'd like to reserve my right.
Thank you. So the motion's open to debate, but I understand that Mr. Kington has an amendment. Mr. Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our residents have always taken an interest in what the council spends on different services, and it's not surprising that residents' interest and concern have become more focused as we tell them that funding now available will not deliver all the services they've become used to, and that hard choices have to be made. Of course, the fact that they do challenge us more on council spending and service priorities might be uncomfortable or even frustrating for members, especially if residents focus on one aspect of spend and ignore what we might perceive to be a more urgent or higher priority funding need. However, we can't ignore residents when they ask for that information, and we cannot complain of unfair criticism if we fail to give it to them, and they make assumptions about why we fail to be open. The cost of top management pay and associated costs is a typical want-to-know cost centre for residents. Yet at Surrey County Council it remains an unknown, and as such an invitation for scepticism by those who believe the council has something to hide. But this is not only about residents, Mr. Chairman, for it is important that members also know what portion of the budget is spent on high-level salaries, on interims and on redundancies, so we can make judgments about priorities for spending and value for money. Alongside Councillor Fiona White, I've tried at PPDC meetings to make this a monitoring role for the committee, but we have been pushed back by the Conservative members whose main argument against is based on a false analysis of what my request and now this amendment means. Everyone accepts that the Chief Executive is the paid head of service who determines the staffing structure of this council and has management responsibility for appointments, redundancies and overall costs. But nothing in the amendment takes that away from the Chief Executive's role in deciding staffing structures. The Chief Executive will still continue to make those decisions. However, members have a right to take an overview on what the total costs of those decisions are, because monitoring the decisions and spend of officers is very much our role, even when that officer with responsibility is the Chief Executive. I therefore trust that when speaking in this debate, no member will once again misinterpret this suggestion as an attempt to do the job of our Head of Service Chief Executive. But unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, that's not only the false argument that's been used to block this request for more open government. We've been told that it's the role of each scrutiny committee to monitor staff budgets within their committee remit. Now, whilst that's progress, at least there's an acceptance that pay costs should be monitored by members, the truth is that individual select committees have never undertaken that role, and certainly no select committee has taken a strategic monitoring view of senior pay costs across the council. And please don't tell me again that the information is available on the website. It's not in any meaningful format. And looking at information on the website is not the same as monitoring, asking questions and reviewing trends in a committee. And please don't tell me either that it's found in the annual pay policy statement. Again, it is not. Mr. Chairman, open and transparent government requires that all this council's expenditure is published openly and transparently, and that information on spend is monitored, or at least available to be monitored. It's now time for the resistance to monitoring the cost of senior management salaries, interim appointments and redundancies was abandoned. Members on this side of the chamber have made the case for it. Our residents demand it. So I ask the new leadership of this council to abandon all those failed arguments of his predecessor against the monitoring of senior pay costs and to support this reasonable, transparent and democratic addition to the PPDC's terms of reference. Mr. Chairman, I move the amendment.
Mr. Kington. Mr. Darby, you're seconding the motion. Would you like to reserve your position or speak now?
No, I'll speak now if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go.
Thank you. Transformation, we hear a lot about it. It's a much-used word, quite rightly. But the next word I would use is transparency, as Mr. Kington has already mentioned. Yesterday in the briefing session there was numerous mentions of our culture, our behaviours, and not just of our officers but of our members as well. Reference to accountability, to transparency, as I've said, numbers of references yesterday, and a statement residents need to understand. They most certainly do, but we do too, and that is crucially important. We need information willingly given. It's necessary, obviously, I think, if we're going to save and to transform, we need to spend in order to do so. That may well be sensible. I'm not suggesting that we should get involved in operational issues, nor is Mr. Kington. I only say that it is us who stand for election, and that needs to be taken into account in all the spending we make. It is only when we have full information, willingly given, that we can begin to use the talents that we all have on both sides of this chamber. My question is, what is there to hide? The computer needs to say yes, not to be pre-programmed to say no. There has been enormous progress over the last few months in the what information we have, a willingness to get involved, as John O'Reilly has so eloquently said this morning. But there are great hopes for the scrutiny process. We now need action to follow the words. not having culture which is secrecy. So the word is transparency. I have no hesitation in supporting this motion as amended. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Darby. So just to clarify for us all, the amendment proposed by Mr. Kingston reads as follows. This Council therefore resolves to amend the terms of reference of the PPDC to provide for the monitoring of the costs of senior management salaries, interim appointments and redundancies. Mr. Botten, are you minded to accept the amendment or not?
Chairman, I'm pleased to accept the amendment.
Oliver. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, sorry, just a point of order. On the lay-round sheet, it says this Council resolves to, and it adds a piece in bold, but there's also one bullet point which has been removed from the bit that's laid around. Just want to confirm that we have actually deleted a section as well as added a section, because it's not clear here.
Thank you, Mr. Essex. That part had already been withdrawn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm disappointed here that Mr. Botten has accepted this amendment, and I would ask at this stage that perhaps you give a ruling on whether you're going to take each of the three resolutions separately, or whether this is going to be treated as one motion.
I'm prepared to take them separately.
Thank you. In which case, I can indicate now that we will agree two of them and not the third. And I'm afraid to disappoint Mr. Kingston, but we cannot agree, and I will not agree, his amendment. This is not about a lack of transparency in any sense. It's not about ignoring our residents. You know, whether he likes it or not, we do publish our budget. That budget sets a cap on the total cost of our workforce. It also clearly sets out the total sum that's been set aside for transformation. Later in this agenda, which again he dismisses as a transparent public document, we will be looking at the Surrey pay policy. That includes all of the details of the remuneration of senior officers. It sets out the redundancy process and all of the key policies that we follow. Mr. Chairman, I mean, this, my view on this is that the Chief Executive, through this Council, is given a fixed budget within which she has to work. It is for her to decide what resource she needs at what point in the process. That is entirely an operational matter. It is a fixed sum. She will be measured and her team will be measured on the performance and the way in which they deliver the targets that have been set for her. If she decides she needs more interim appointments in the short term to deliver that performance target, then that is a decision for her. That isn't to say in any sense that I support the recruitment and the retention of interims. Absolutely not. And in the substantive debate, I agree completely with Mr. Botten that we need to move as quickly as possible to a robust, permanent workforce. That isn't just about the money, it is about the sustainability. We cannot and should not run this Council on interims. But the reality is, there are some challenges in recruiting the right people. So actually, we need to move at pace, and that pace requires us, on occasions, to use interims with their expertise and their wider experience than perhaps we have available to us in this organisation. PPDC, the People and I don't remember what it was, Performance Development Committee, on which Mr. Kingston sits and Mrs. White. Yes, we have had this debate under the previous leader and indeed in my time. That committee's role is to ensure that we appoint the right people in these senior roles, and we have a significant appointment to look at and consider this afternoon. That is what we should be focusing on now, is getting the right people in place. And I don't believe that this amendment takes the matter any further forward. This organisation is going through its biggest transformation that it's experienced in many, many years. We have to get this right. We've discussed all morning, and indeed we'll continue to discuss how those transformation programmes are working, whether they're delivering, and whether they are improving the outcomes for our residents. We will be losing staff through redundancy and resignation. The Children's Services is currently in consultation. 3,500 people that is a difficult time for those individuals. And it is leaving gaps in this organisation. Those have to be filled if we're going to move these transformation programmes forward. It has to be said that the county has not always been the first employer of choice for residents, for individuals applying here. So, we have to recognise that actually whilst we go through this process of change, we will have to rely upon interims at some level. As soon as we've completed the restructuring of those areas, we will know exactly what roles we need, who we have within the organisation to fill them, and at that point we will start to, and we will see a decrease in the interims. I think, Mr. Chairman, in terms of the second point of Mr. Botton's motion, in terms of working with the Surrey districts and boroughs, I'm very pleased he's given me yet another opportunity to repeat my very real focus on partnership working. Collaboration with the district and boroughs is absolutely key to this and essential. We should share buildings, we should share staff, we should share ideas, and we should share the delivery of better outcomes for our residents. That's why I mentioned in my statement earlier about local partnership boards, and what he's proposing is entirely consistent with what I've already set out as the way forward. Indeed, it's not just with the district and boroughs. We work ever closer with Surrey Hartlands and the NHS. We will be looking at joint appointments, senior appointments, to make sure that we are aligned in terms of where our Surrey Health Plan goes and this council. So it's not just about making the best use of our residents' money, and I and all of us in this chamber are acutely aware that we have an obligation to do that. It is about working on joint solutions, and I'm very excited about those opportunities and getting people engaged in those. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm disappointed that we trivialised what is an important motion from Mr. Bolton in terms of moving to full recruitment, because moving to full recruitment suggests that we have got a long way down our transformation plans, and indeed encouraged by his suggestion that we continue to work closely with the district and boroughs. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Mr. Townsend.
I wasn't going to speak until the leader used the word trivialise. And I thought I think you might regret using that word. And I think maybe you ought to apologise for it. The members of the public do and are very interested, as my colleague has said, in the wage structure here, particularly at the top level. And rumour, as we all know, flashes around. Oh, well, they're on $250,000, there's 6 directors been appointed for children's services, all at 100,000 plus each, and they're sitting there thinking, well, where do you get those figures from? They're made up because we don't know, but people say them. They then add them all up and say, right, there's $1 million. We're even trying. And couldn't that be better used on getting the social workers, etc., that we need? That might pay for a couple of social workers for 2 or 3 years, let alone more than that. So to say we trivialise it, I think is a big mistake, and is a sad indictment of the way this authority, run by the Conservatives, actually looks at it. And I think that's very sad, because I've got a lot of time for the leader, and I think he is trying to do things in the right way. But I think here he's made a serious mistake. I think if the public find out that we are trivialising the senior pay of staff at this council, I think it's a disgraceful thing to say. Thank you, Chairman.
If there are no other speakers, I will call Mr. Forster to second the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This motion calls on the Council to be more measured in the way that we appoint high-cost staff and temporary staff. I think that's really important. We want staff to be permanent, so they're committed to Surrey, so they're committed to delivering our services. Temporary staff don't have the same level of commitment. The County Council cannot plead poverty to the government by asking for more government grant, or plead poverty to residents by asking them to pay more council tax if we are paying such high salaries for such short length of times. It's double standards, residents see right through it, and when I have a children's centre meeting tomorrow, they will see right through it and completely disrespect the authority when we're asking them to make significant changes. As my group leader Chris Botton highlighted, we want to see more shared posts so we can use better expertise within Surrey or outside Surrey, depending. Local government has seen some great examples of collaborative working. We want to see more of that. We've had one example in Surrey between Mole Valley District Council and the County Council, where we've shared a chief executive and a strategic director. Yet that needs to go further rather than stop, and that is disappointing. I was hoping that we could agree this motion so we would set in train some real positive improvements, and I understand the Conservative Group want to support 2 out of 3, but not the third. And I think that is very disappointing. The Conservative Group isn't willing to have a comprehensive look at staff costs and staff strategies, redundancies. That is what that extra amendment did. And I think that is very disappointing, that it's right that we have that democratic scrutiny of, well, where is this money going? Who is being paid what? And I think that's a real lost opportunity. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Forster. Mr. Botton to conclude.
Thank you, Chairman. While I sit in opposition in this council, I still want to be able to go out and be proud of the things that we do. I still want to be able to go out to residents and where I think we're right, say so. I once sat in on a PPDC meeting for Mrs. White, my colleague, when she was unavailable. And albeit under the last leader, I found it challenging because a number of decisions were taken before the meeting commenced, and a number of important decisions were taken after the meeting finished. And I felt myself no wiser, no more clued in, and certainly having no stake in the decisions that were taken at that meeting. My view is that it's always right to be transparent. It's always right to do the right thing. And I believe this motion, with the proposed amendment, covers the right bases in the right way. We should have nothing to be ashamed of, and we should have nothing to hide.
Thank you, Mr. Botton. Mr. Kington. That's agreed. We'll have a recorded vote on all of them. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll move to the vote by a show of hands. The first point is to this council therefore resolves to adopt a policy of recruiting to permanent positions where appropriate. Will all those in favour please show and also press the yes button.
Not working. Such cowards they are.
So I'll begin by calling names, and if you can indicate whether you're for or against this element of the motion. Mrs. Angel, Mrs. Zad, Mr. Beckett, Mr. Benison, absent. Miss Boot is absent. Mr. Botton, Mrs. Bowles, Absent. Mrs. Bramall. Mr. Brett Warburton. Mr. Carrasco is absent. Mr. Chapman. Mrs. Clack.
Against.
Mr. Cooksey. Mrs. Curran. Mr. Darby. Mr. Deach. Absent. Mr. Alwood. Mr. Essex. Mr. Robert Evans. Mr. Tim Evans. Mr. Few. Mr. Forster. Mr. Fury. Mr. Furness. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Goodman. Mr. Goodwin. Absent. Mrs. Goodwin. Miss Griffiths. Dr. Grant Duff. Mr. Galati. Mr. Hall. Absent. Mrs. Hammond. Mr. Hampson. Absent. Mr. Harmer. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harrison. Mr. Hawkins. Miss Teeth. Mr. Hussain. Mrs. Isles. Mr. Islam. Mr. Kemp. Mr. Kington. Mr. Knight. Mrs. Lake. Mrs. Lay. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Lewis. Mr. MacLeod. Mr. McIntosh. Mr. Mallet. Mr. Mansfield. Mr. Martin. Mrs. Mason. Mrs. Mooney. Miss Morley.
Against.
Mrs. Mosley. Mrs. Mountain. Mrs. Muir. Mr. Sorry, I've got my glasses. Just really. Mr. Newty. Mr. Oliver. Mr. O'Reilly. Dr. Povey. Mr. Ramsdale.
Against.
Mrs. Rivers. Mrs. Rush. Mr. Samuels. Mr. Spence. Absent. Mrs. Steeds. Dr. Zanto. Mr. Taylor. Miss Thompson. Mrs. Thorne. Mr. Townsend. Miss Turner, 4. Miss Turner Stewart. Mr. Walsh. Mrs. Watson. Mrs. White. Mr. Whittam. Mrs. Young.
So the result is 17 for, 52 against. So parts 1 and 2 are passed, part 3 is lost. Thank you. Now moving to the second motion, standing in the name of Mr. Jonathan Essex. Under Standing Order 12.3, Council has to decide if it wishes to debate this motion today. Does Council wish to debate this motion today? Thank you. Mr. Essex, would you move your motion, please?
Thank you. This motion calls for us to accept the current climate reality that faces us. In October last year, the International Panel on Climate Change reported on how we have only 12 years to change how we live globally. In December, it was reported that the rate of Greenland's ice melt has quadrupled. And in January, NASA discovered a huge cavern has opened up under Antarctica, and a polar vortex destabilised, sending freezing weather that should have been over the Arctic over the American Midwest instead. January was the warmest month in Australia ever. In February, the Met Office reported that the next 5 years could see us breaking safe climate thresholds, risking global climate instability and runaway climate heating. This requires us to do something. This motion acknowledges this is not something to be taken lightly, but requires urgent action. That is why we need to recognise the seriousness of this as a climate emergency. But whilst increasing climate disasters are now inevitable, we can still hold out hope if we commit, like others, to act on this together, not just here in Surrey, but worldwide. Because dealing with climate change must mean we accept that our lifestyles and economy must end their dependence on fossil fuels, and that also means we have committed, therefore, to stand up stand up for those already vulnerable to increasing disasters worldwide while restoring the possibility of a future for all humanity. This motion highlights that whilst we have taken action in the past, continuing this is not sufficient to address the scale of the problem. The motion closes in calling for a sufficient response. This starts by updating our actions to make sure that we can commit to become carbon neutral by 2030, which is what the IPCC, that's what the climate scientists require. We need enough funding, enough transformation, enough leadership, not just in the Council, but to show we can lead across Surrey on this issue. We have committed Surrey County Council to reduce our financial budget by 2030. It is vital that we do the same to drastically reduce our carbon emissions. This should be part of our 2030 vision for Surrey. Now, action on climate change requires a combination of actions from the top down, which is why the government has a plan, and from the bottom up by councils, the wider public sector, businesses and civil society. And the Council, I believe, has a pivotal role as a place shaper and in providing local leadership. And action on climate change should be just that. It should be locally led. And businesses operating in Surrey are already committing to pledges such as these. A week ago, I met the Innovation Director for Metrobus, part of the Go Ahead Group, who have pledged to be zero carbon by 2030, which is what this motion sets out. They will be introducing hydrogen fuel cell buses to run through Hawley, powered by wind energy from off the Kent coast from next summer. This is made possible through government and EU support for new buses, which will be made here in Britain. They made a pledge and they asked government to make sure that they could realise it. This motion is similar. We could do just like that bus company has already pledged to do. We could pledge a target. We could then make a plan of what we want to do about it. And we could then seek support from government where there are funding gaps. This would be a way of underpinning how we can lead the way, provide new solutions, enterprises, and lead our communities in starting to live in ways that are consistent with what a sustainable future looks like. I would urge you to support this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Essex. Mrs. White, would you like to speak now to second or reserve your right?
I'd like to speak now, Chairman, please. Chairman and fellow councillors, I'm very happy to second this motion proposed by Councillor Essex. First, I'm pleased to say that a lot of progress has been made in Surrey since the proposal by Thames Water to build an incinerator in Guildford at the beginning of this century. The levels of recycling have leapt, and there was much more emphasis on reduce, reuse and recycle. That application was a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of people in Surrey, not just in Guildford. However, there's still a lot to be done. For one thing, I think we all need to emphasise to the government that they should continue to support the Paris Agreement by meeting this country's own climate commitments. As a country, we should also be leading in international efforts to combat climate change. As a county, we should be emphasising that we need to reduce the use of fossil fuels. We should lead by example by making sure, as far as possible, that we improve the insulation of our own buildings, build in the most up-to-date techniques in any new buildings, and install top-class insulation and renewable energy where we already own them. In that regard, I'd like to just record my thanks to Councillor Tim Hall, who unfortunately is not here, who, while he was Cabinet member, helped to get solar panels put on the roof of one of my local schools. It made a lot of difference to their bills, as well as reducing their energy use and their climate footprint. It's important that we reduce greenhouse gases, most of which come from burning of fossil fuels. If we don't, not only will we get rising average temperatures, but also extreme weather events, changes to wildlife, loss of species. Life for all of us will become more uncomfortable, and it will disproportionately affect people on lower incomes. It's difficult to say that one or even two particular weather events are due to climate change, but a pattern is developing already. It's not that long ago that extreme rainfall meant unusual flooding in Surrey, and what used to be a 50-year event is now becoming far more frequent. We need to do more to encourage people to reuse things instead of throwing them away by running or enabling communities to run repair cafes. We need to... Okay? As a council, personally I support the young people who've been demonstrating about climate change issues. I'm pleased that they have recognised there is an issue and are prepared to take some action to do something about it. It's their future world we're talking about. They will have to clean up this mess long after I venture to say a number of people in this chamber, have departed this mortal coil. We are in the middle of a climate emergency. We need a firm commitment to include a target date. Without a target, we won't know whether we're going to get there. And we need to use the power of Surrey County Council to change the course of history and avoid the global climate apocalypse that we are facing. Thank you, Chairman.
Right. So the motion's open to debate, but I understand Mr. Goodman has an amendment. Mr. Goodman, do you have a seconder? Mr. Elwood?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to reserve my right, please.
Thank you, sir. Could the officers circulate the amendment now, please? Have another minute to look through it, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So I call Mr. Goodman to move the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. Surrey's 2030 vision states residents of Surrey want to live in a clean, safe and green communities where people and organisations embrace environmental responsibilities. The debate today will examine what we have achieved, the opportunities of the future, and what we can all do, including residents and business, to protect our environment. Richard Attenborough said, "We are the first generation to tackle environmental issues, and we owe it to our children and future children to do more." For me, it's about attitude. Well, 6 years ago, when I was given the environmental portfolio, I had a lot to learn, so I read and started to understand its importance and what we can do to make a difference. To me, it's not just about having a degree in environmental studies, or not about watching environmental programs or saying you support improving environmental issues. It's all about caring for the future of our environment and being prepared to take action. And that's exactly what I have tried to achieve. The service has worked hard, and I believe this council is among some of the greenest in the country, because we haven't just talked about doing things, we've taken action. Now, I'm aware that some councils have committed to a date of 2030, but I'm not going to commit this council to that. There's a lot of work to do with our borough and district colleagues and with the government to achieve the zero options in the future. And I'll remind people that the government's target is 60% reduction in carbon by 2030. Surrey County Council have a carbon and energy policy already in place and is due to renewal later this year, and I see that as a really important document to update. We have decreased our carbon emissions from our own buildings and street lighting, highways fleet and business miles. We set a target in 2015 of improving our carbon footprint by 10% by 2018-19 compared to 2013-14. But by 2017-18, we've already achieved a 25% reduction. And indications are by 18-19, this will go up to 30%. I then looked at what we've achieved since 2009, and that shows a reduction of 60% against the government's target, 60% by 2030. These improvements have been achieved by investment in energy efficiency and carbon reduction measures across the council estate, including schools, investment in street lighting, which has reduced carbon by 6,000 tonnes, changes to the council estate, changes to carbon content of electricity, and changes to the way council staff work. We have led the way in a number of areas to reduce carbon and improve the environment in Surrey. We have a low emissions policy, EV policy, a planning policy that promotes energy saving, and we were one of the first councils in the country to implement an EV policy for new buildings in housing. We now have 160 Euro 6 buses compared to none in 2015, and electric buses operating the park and ride in Guildford. The County Council have a cycling strategy to support the development of cycling as a means of transport and to secure economic, health and environmental benefits for Surrey. Schools are actively encouraging walking and cycling, and we have 20 schools that have been accredited with the Bronze Award for the nationally recognised Mode Shift Stars of School Travel Plans. Congestion and the volume of cars on our roads, which are some of the busiest in the UK, outside London, does create further carbon. But we have secured over 50 million funding since 2015 from LEPS to improve our road network. But more is necessary, especially with the increased projected future of housing developments. We have a waste strategy that achieves an overall recycling rate of 54.8% and several districts achieving over 60%. We collect and use for energy 38,000 tonnes of food waste, which is 20% more than in 2015-16. We have reused shops in our CRCs, which have diverted 800 tonnes of waste that would have gone to landfill. And shortly we will have recycling centres only in 4 of our small CRCs. We have a Surrey-wide single-use plastic policy strategy. And I'm pleased to announce today that the county will be the first in the UK to use only paper straws to business and to consumer, when plastic straws will stop across the county by the end of September. Our workforce have reduced their business miles by 10% over the last 5 years, and we have a force that are moving to become an agile force, with 75% of the workforce operating this way in the coming years. The quality of our air is so important to the health of our residents, and we secured funding 145k from DEFRA to improve the education of children earlier last year. And we have a further bid for 700,000 to do a similar amount, plus infrastructure for this year now. Improving the quality of air is not all down to government and the local authorities. It's down to all of us. And I hope you will join me in taking part in the UK Clean Air Day on June the 20th, which I've committed this council to take part. reducing carbon covers so many aspects of council business and our daily lives. There's no single answer, but by working together, districts and boroughs and businesses, we can make a difference. So we can be the first generation to leave this planet in a better condition than we took it over, and better conditions that our future generations will see the benefit of our environment. I will, after this meeting, be contacting Michael Gove and writing to him on the contents of today's meeting, because I think it's really important he is aware of the issues facing Surrey County Council and other councils throughout the country, and I hope you'll agree with the amended motion. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Goodman. Before we proceed further, I'd like you to circulate that perhaps by electronically to everybody too. Thank you. And again, before we proceed further, I've confirmed with our monitoring officer that this amendment does not negate but just replaces. So I call on Mr. Essex. Are you going to accept this amendment or not?
I'm not. Should I give my response now or later in the debate?
Should reserve till later in the debate.
Okay.
So I call Mrs. White. Going to be later too.
Thank you, Chairman. Someone's got to go first. I'm fully supportive of the motion, but not the amendment. The amendment completely negates the purpose of the original motion. It removes the commitment to declaring a climate emergency, and it also deletes the pledge to make Surrey climate neutral by 2030. Those were the two key fundamental commitments in the motion, which the amendment has decided that should be put in the bin. I'm really frustrated by that. This motion should have had cross-party support. It has had cross-party support elsewhere in the country, but you've decided we don't want that. And to be honest, I should be frustrated, but actually I'm not really surprised, because your government and your party have dropped the ball when it comes to the environment. The prime example being, as soon as we left government, you abolished the Department for Energy and Climate Change. That was how much you were committed to climate change. Climate change is unquestionably one of the biggest issues of our time. Brexit and other stuff is on the news at the moment, but that is the issue that predates Brexit, and that's the issue we'll be talking about for years to come. It's to the point, climate change is so important that actually it's affecting global prosperity, it's affecting people's security, people's well-being, people's health. That's why we should declare a climate emergency, and that's why I want to vote for the original motion. It's clear that there's an appetite to lead on climate change. Councillor White highlighted that children from across the country made a good protest. But actually, they're leading the way. The government, the council, this council, and the Conservatives aren't. They're not just not leading those. They're not just following those children. They're running in the opposite direction. Children, 8-year-olds in Woking, have got more leadership skills than this council and this government, and I'm appalled at that. We need to declare a climate change emergency.
Mrs. Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to report to members here, I have had more emails on this subject than on any other ever. And one yesterday from two 15-year-old girls, Lottie and Tilly, sent to many other councillors about the world that they will inherit from us. By naming climate change an emergency should mean that instead of doing some things we can do to mitigate the risk, we do everything we can do to mitigate the risk. And at least 27 councils in this country have done just this. They have passed a similar motion. And I believe that we should too. Thank you.
Mrs. Rivers. Mr. Hawkins.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very pleased that Mr. Goodman mentioned single-use plastics, because, to my mind, the most forward-looking borough in Surrey, namely Surrey Heath, we have adopted a commitment to reduce single-use plastics. Now, I'm not going to grandstand, or at least I wasn't going to grandstand like a previous speaker, but Surrey Heath is, of course, Conservative-controlled, and this is a Conservative policy led by our Conservative MP in the form of Michael Gove. But the Council we have agreed to end the sale of all and the provision of all single-use plastics. We're going to increase awareness, but most importantly of all, we are going to work with the electorate. We are going to work with all of the people to encourage them to start from the bottom, to reduce all the single-use plastics. And in doing so, the Camberley Theatre, we've been single-use plastic free for over a year.
Community services, water dispenser used in Windle Valley Day Centre in Bagshot. The Arena Leisure Centre, 100% biodegradable cups are sold in the cafe. At Lightwater Leisure Centre, in my colleague Mr Mansfield's area, that they are switching to paper straws. The simple fact is, rather than grandstand, we are getting on, working with the residents, working with the population, working with industry to improve the environment. We're doing it quietly, we're working forward, we're pushing everybody in encouragement, and we should all take it on board, and I'm totally in favour of the amended amendment from Mr Goodman. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Mr Robert Evans.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm rising to speak against the amendment by Councillor Goodman because I think it's negative and it's not in the interests of the people of Surrey. And, colleagues, this is not just about paper cups and straws, it's much wider than that. The amendment seeks to delete the part where this Council recognises it has a duty on climate change. Do colleagues really not think that we have such a duty to make Surrey carbon neutral by 2030? That is our lifetime. It's only 11 years away, and I hope we'll all be around to see that. Instead, Councillor Goodman asks for an 80% reduction by 2050. Now, he's a young man. Well, that's what the policy, the amended motion talks about, an 80% emissions cut by 2050. Now, Councillor Goodman is obviously a young man, but will he still, and will we all still be around in 31 years to see the benefits of that? I think we've got to be much bolder, much more ambitious, set much higher standards, as other colleagues have said. The amended motion asks us also, or says that the Council should be proactive in contributing to many consultations. Well, really, is that the best we can do, contributing to consultations? There are many of us here, and many of the residents we represent, who are at best dubious about consultations, and if that is what we are going to do, I don't think it's really very ambitious. The public are concerned. They do want us to be active. These amendments, I think, weaken the original motion. And at a time when we are at a stage where possibly the United Kingdom is set to leave the European Union, which has driven forth environmental standards, it has pushed and set high environmental targets, I don't believe now is the time for this Council to be watering down a motion that sets high targets, high standards, and serving the people of this Council and this county. Thank you.
Mr Harmer.
Thank you, Chairman. I was very concerned about this motion because I agree with the sentiments of it, all of the sentiments of it, but it requires the Council to commit to some things which are outside its power, outside its ability to do. And for that reason, I did suggest to colleagues and to Mr Goodman that we might engage in amendments to change those parts to make it possible that we could do all the things that we're committing or proposing to commit today, and which I hope we will end up committing to things which we could probably achieve. If I worry about what the position of my grandchildren, it is that it's all very well to say that we're going to do all these things, and we're going to do it in ways which enable us to sustain our quality of life and possibly improve it slightly over the next period of time. My biggest concern is that we're going to require a great deal more electricity in order to do most of those things. And I see no sign that central government is in a position to fix the generating capability of this country. If you're going to rely entirely on solar power, I don't think we'll achieve it. That's a very serious concern, and I do think that we ought to be campaigning with central government to have a coherent policy by which we're going to have enough power of a sort which is acceptable to us, clean electricity power, to be able to fulfil the aspirations of that generation as it comes along. So that's the primary reason why I'm supporting the amendment, that those things need to be done. I do want to add a second thing, that those people who present these things, and I'm talking to Mr Essex in the first instance here, I was always taught that you have to be very careful that if you quote references, that your references are satisfactorily accurate. Now, from my personal experience and knowledge, the climate changes which are alleged to have occurred in the Midwest and that area have not changed in the last 44 years since I first went to those places. They had the same patterns. I've been watching on the BBC. They show you what's going on in the rest of the world on a regular basis, most nights. The temperature patterns have been behaving exactly the same, remarkably similar, within a degree or two. And the point where the two climates clash is still St. Louis. And that wouldn't be happening if things were as is being claimed. There are a whole lot of other things you can argue about, which are correct. Greenland, Antarctica, etc. But I do urge that people who want to make those arguments ensure that they are accurate as to what is changed and what is not.
Thank you, Mrs. Hart. Mrs. White.
Thank you, Chairman. You won't be surprised to know that I'm not going to support the amendment. Chairman, going back to what Mr. Harmer has just said about evidence, only this morning we've heard that the head of the Environment Agency is warning that because of the impact of climate change combined with population growth, we face what he calls an existential threat of water shortages. He says, and these are his words, not mine, England will reach the jaws of death, the point at which we take action, unless we take action to change things, we will not have enough water to supply our needs. He attributes half that problem to climate change, which will mean hotter and drier summers in the UK. And this morning on my way in, I was listening to Radio 4, The Life Scientific, presented by the wonderful Jim Al-Khalili. And they had somebody there who has been doing a lot of studies on the impact of carbon and the southern oceans. And she very clearly made the point that we have been digging up carbon that has been safely locked away in the earth where it was doing us no harm. We've been digging it up, burning it and releasing it. And the impact on those southern oceans could be absolutely disastrous. Chairman, faced with these facts, faced with the difficulties that we are looking at, more than difficulties that we're looking at, a climate change disaster, Mr. Goodman, is this really all you have to offer? I honestly do not understand how you could have got to this point. I will not support the amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the original motion falls down on the basis of extreme language. Declaring a climate emergency in Surrey when Surrey is essentially an ecosystem that is a net absorber of carbon. If you look at our statistics that we're the most wooded county in England, we have the most beautiful countryside in the southeast, and Mr. Goodman has proposed a series of actions to preserve and protect our countryside for years to come. So I think we really need to recognise that declaring a climate change emergency in Surrey when we are absorbing much of the pollution from London through our landscape naturally, and the biodiversity is rich, and demonstrates that Surrey does not have a climate change emergency, so I support the amendment.
Mr. Essex.
Well, frankly, I'm shocked. Surrey's not a net absorber of climate change, carbon emissions. Surrey's emissions from road transport went up last year. I think it's all very well evoking the spirit of David Attenborough, but talk is cheap. What this motion is asking for is a commitment to plan and do something about the problem. The government is committed to a legally binding target of at least 60% by 2030. That's entirely consistent with us making a pledge, because that commitment was made a number of years ago, which is aligned to where climate science is now. And hey, if we aim for zero, and that means that we contribute to the government exceeding its 60% target, which is what it's required to do, and we get to do something which is aligned to what the climate scientists are saying, rather than debating whether we believe them or not. They peer review each other as scientists. I don't think we as politicians need to debate whether climate science is real or not. We need to get on with doing something about it. We could talk about single-use plastics, but frankly, I think that's just clutching at paper straws. It's a separate issue. It's a separate issue. It's got nothing to do with climate change. We could ban single-use plastics and still have runaway climate change. But what we did with single-use plastics is we committed to eliminate it across Surrey. This motion is proposing entirely the same thing to deal with a far bigger problem. And on that issue, we sat down, we employed someone for 6 months to produce a strategy with short, medium and long-term targets. We agreed co-working across the districts and boroughs, and then we got on with it. That's what this motion is asking for. It's not difficult. Euro 6 buses, yes, they're better for air pollution, but they still burn diesel. It doesn't deal with the problem. Clean air days, that's fine. But carbon emissions from transport across Surrey went up last year. It's all very well praising how well we're doing, but frankly, what we're doing currently is not enough. And yes, we would love to leave the world in a better condition for our children, but it's not going to happen if we don't deal with this one issue, because this issue will swamp all others, and that's why I cannot support this. This still waters down and renders virtually ineffectual the original motion. It emphasises what we're already doing, rather than making any commitments to do anything else that we haven't already committed to do. Firstly, we should pledge to make carbon neutral by 2030. That's what the climate scientists say. And the duty at the start of this motion is because currently there is no duty on local councils to deal with climate change. That's why, under austerity politics, spending on this issue has been cut higher than things like social care. We should make it a duty, and we really should commit to do what's required. And the 2030 target, can't we respect scientists? There's currently a massive gap between what scientists say what's needed and what politicians say that the technological and the engineers say is possible. I'm an engineer. I think we need to start with where we are, but commit to going further than we can possibly believe we might imagine. Now, if a bus company can do that, why can't we?
Mr. Essex, you can start your concluding paragraph,
I will start
please.
concluding. And there's all this talk about the Surrey estate and what we ourselves as a council can do. Well, the government, when it had its climate target, didn't just commit to what happened in the Houses of Parliament. It committed to provide leadership across the country. And I think in our own lives we can commit to do what we do ourselves. But once we do beyond that, I think as politicians we aren't managing just the budget of what happens from Surrey County Council, but we're elected to provide leadership. And that means working together with businesses, councils, public sector organisations and trying to make a difference. That's why it's a pledge. I'm not suggesting we have a legally binding commitment written in law. I'm suggesting we aim to do something far, far more than our current commitments and far, far more than what this amendment reaffirms that we're already doing. And for that reason,
thank you, Mr.
And for that reason,
please conclude now.
For that reason, I'd urge you to vote against the amendment, and I'd request that we have a recorded vote. Thank you.
Mr. Ramsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quite frankly, I'm very sad, very disappointed at the quality of this debate. It all seems to be wandering around different versions of words, like the difference between do I have a duty or should I seek, the difference between what we should be doing by 2030 or 2050. To me, what matters is what we're doing now.
Order, please, Mr. Essex. Do carry on, Mr. Ramsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What matters to me is what we're doing now. We've had good suggestions from the portfolio holder about the sorts of things that we're doing, and I know he personally, if you look out in the car park, is setting an extremely good example. It's all about what we as individuals, what we as councillors, what we can do here in Surrey today and over the next, dare I say, year or so. I don't know how many of us will live to 2030, I don't know how many of us will live another 10 years, but I certainly want to get stuff done now. And I'm just amazed that as an opposition group you don't come up with tangible suggestions of things we can do, things we can invest money in, but simply pontificate on changing the words and changing the dates. I'm sorry about this, but...
Mr. Essex, would you please let this gentleman finish? He let you finish. Have some courtesy. Mr. Ramsdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for me, this rejection of the amendment simply falls down because the original motion was requiring us to commit to things that are outside our control. I want to commit to things that I can do something about, make a difference with, and achieve in the next few years. I'm just sorry our opposition don't seem to see it that way.
Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a lot of sympathy with the motion as proposed, and what I would say is I think we're all on the same side. We all recognise the challenge before us, and we need to do something about it. And perhaps the style of words here is important, and there is a difference of emphasis, maybe from different people. I do object to Mr. Forster suggesting that we're running in the opposite direction, and whether the relevant government department is there in the way that perhaps it used to be. What I have got here are the national statistics published by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And those, for instance, show that greenhouse gas emissions in this country in 2017 were estimated to be 42% lower than they were in 1990. If we look at CO2 emissions, for the same time period, CO2 emissions are estimated to have decreased by 37.4%. And these are important statistics. So we're all wanting to see the reduction. There's been an immense shift in electricity production, the almost total closure of coal-fired power stations, wind farms, which on the best days now are providing 27% of the total energy need, total electricity need of the country. So to suggest that we're running in the opposite direction, I think is a fabrication, and it is quite wrong. Of course, we're all taking this very seriously, and we want to see progress. And indeed, Surrey County Council has seen progress. I'm not sure, though, whether beating our chests and declaring a climate emergency and saying it's all going to be fixed by 2030 is the right way forward. I would want to be more convinced of what we could really do to get there by 2030, rather than simply going through with some gesture politics here. So I think I will support the amended motion, where we are, in fact, continuing to work with the government, continuing to work with boroughs and districts, and of course we have got an updated Surrey County Council carbon and energy policy, which will be presented in December. It may well be at some future point I will be in a position to support doing something by 2030. For the moment, I do believe that we are doing things, I do believe that we are being effective, and I'm happy to support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. So the seconder of the amendment, Mr. Elwood.
Thank you, Chairman. As the lead on air quality at Guildford, areas to improve the air quality where issues arise, and indeed that is often by traffic management. Slower speeds, maybe traffic moving in another direction. We have quite a few of those smaller areas, and we are doing them within resources as quickly as we can. We're members of the Surrey Air Quality Alliance, I would stress that. Again, I have introduced, or am introducing, a scheme whereby school children, particularly at primary schools, can monitor the quality of air at drop-off and pick-up times. This is being run in conjunction with the uni, who are providing air quality meters so that the children can measure how the nitrous oxide levels change, particularly when parents are sitting outside the school with their engines idling. And with my community safety hat on, that is shortly going to become an offence in Guildford. But we're going to try and do a two-pronged attack. The other benefit of this school scheme, it will help with antisocial parking, which affects everybody here across the county, as we know. The other thing we're doing, and County Councillor Furness over there is the expert on this, just to drop him in, is we're moving towards a sustainable movement corridor on to the west of Guildford.
Mr.
And I'd
Howard,
like to
can we conclude?
Yeah, I will.
Thank you.
I'll basically conclude by saying I think targets should be manageable. Doesn't mean to say they can't be reviewable. So I would urge you to support the current motion, bearing in mind all the good work we are doing. Maybe it should be reviewed next time round. Thank you, Chairman. The amended motion. Beg your pardon.
And to conclude, Mr. Goodman.
Yes, I would try to be brief. I think Peter Martin sums it up. I think that we all agree that we need to do something. It's the way we do it is perhaps what we're disagreeing. And I will not commit this council to achieve something that I don't think it's purely in their gift to achieve. That's why we will work towards it. What we will also do, and I will include Jonathan and anybody else, as we go through the next 6 months and putting together a new strategy and policy for carbon, we will use all those people interested in working with us, because I will be talking to the Environmental Committee to set up a task group, because that will be cross-party. I don't think the time's right to commit ourselves to 2030, but I think Peter's also right. There may come a time when there's more evidence we will want to do that. But what I do object to, and it's very often that I do bite back with members, but I think Will Foster will regret when he listens to what he said, because we all know how wonderful the Liberals were, and when they were in power, and what happened as soon as they went, we actually got some environmental things under belt. What have we done over the last few years? Road to Zero, environmental 25-year strategy, clean air strategy, and the waste and resources, all done by a Conservative government, and there's a lot more to come. I take what Robert Evans said about consultations around everything, but I can tell you the amount of influence we've had in terms of replying to all those consultations on clean air, the 25 years, are really, really important to shape government policy. And I have a meeting with DEFRA next month to work with them on those two strategies of waste and the clean air strategy. So it's really important to learn from the councils who actually do a pretty good job. And I think when you reflect what we do a pretty good job. But we've got to do more. And that's what I'm committing ourselves to do when we come to the next 6 months. And I would ask people to reflect on what they're saying. I think this council has given good leadership with environmental issues, but there is a lot more to be done, and I accept that. And I hope people will support this amended motion.
Thank you. So I'm going to put the amendment to the vote by show of hands. All those in favour of the amendment?
Recorded vote, please. No idea.
Yes, you have 10, so we will have a recorded vote. If the officers could conduct that now. Thank you.
Members, if you could indicate if you're in support of the amended motion. The amendments. So, some people have left the chamber. So we'll begin. Mrs. Angel.
For.
Mrs. Azad. Mr. Beckett. Mr. Benison. Miss Boot is absent. Mr. Botton. Mrs. Bowes is absent. Mrs. Bramall. Mr. Brett Warburton. Mr. Carrasco is absent. Mr. Chapman. Mrs. Clack. Mr. Cooksey is absent. Mrs. Curran. Mr. Darby. Mr. Deach is absent. Mr. Elwood. Mr. Essex. Mr. Robert Evans. Mr. Tim Evans. Mr. Few. Mr. Forster. Mr. Fury. Mr. Furness. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Goodman. Mr. Goodwin is absent. Mrs. Goodwin. Miss Griffiths. Dr. Grant Duff. Mr. Galati. Mr. Hall is absent. Mrs. Hammond. Mr. Harmer. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harrison. Mr. Hawkins. Miss Heath. Mr. Hussain. Mrs. Isles. Mr. Islam. Mr. Kemp is absent. Mr. Kington. Mr. Knight is absent. Mrs. Lake. Mrs. Lay. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Lewis. Mr. MacLeod. Mr. McIntosh. Mr. Mallet. Mr. Mansfield. Mr. Martin. Mrs. Mason. Mrs. Mooney. Miss Morley. Mrs. Mosley. Mrs. Mountain. Mrs. Muir is absent. Mr. Newty. Mr. Oliver. Mr. O'Reilly. Dr. Povey. Mr. Ramsdale. Absent. Mrs. Rivers. Mrs. Rush. Mr. Samuels. Sorry, Mrs. Rush. Mr. Samuels. Mr. Spence is absent. Mrs. Steeds. Absent. Dr. Santo. Mr. Taylor. Miss Thompson. Gone. 4. Mrs. Thorne. Mr. Townsend. Miss Turner-Stewart. Mr. Walsh. Mrs. Watson. Mrs. White. Mr. Whittam. And Mrs. Young.
So, members, that is 52 for, 13 against, 1 abstention. So the amendment becomes the substantive motion. We've had a thorough debate, so I will move to a vote on the new substantive motion. Mr. Essex, would you like that recorded as well? I'll give you the option. No. So all those in favour of the new motion, please show by hand and press yes. Thank you. All those against? And abstentions? Thank you. So we have 49 yes, 10 no, 3 abstentions, so that is carried. Thank you. Item 9, Surrey Pay Policy Statement 2019-20, page 23 of the agenda. I call Tim Oliver, Leader of the Council, to introduce the report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This Council is asked to approve the Pay Policy Statement for 1920. It's a clear, published and transparent statement of the salary scales for all council employees. As the report says, it covers remuneration levels for all officers, sets out the agreed responsibilities of the People, Performance and Development Committee, and also sets out our policies on equal pay, redundancy and severance. I have to say, I think it's completely wrong to dismiss this document as not providing transparency to our residents on what we pay our staff. What it doesn't say, though, is the enormous amount of work put into this policy by our officers and indeed by the union representatives. We're talking about livelihoods of our dedicated staff here in this policy, and this has been a comprehensive exercise to bring many old and varied policies into line, and it's a testament to those involved that 94% of Unison members and 73% of GMB members voted in favour of it. That tells me that we're working closely with our staff of over 20,000 people to make sure that we get our pay policy right. And with all due respect, I think that's far more important than 4 or 5 members of the PPDC looking at it. It applies to all staff on Surrey pay terms and conditions for both schools and non-schools. Mr. Chairman, there's one point I think is worth making, which is on page 25, which relates to the pay multiple statistics, which you'll see continues to come down, and I think is about 8.1 to 1, which is a decrease on the previous years, and that's the narrowing of the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid employee within the organisation and well within the government target range. Mr. Chairman, I commend this report to members.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to seek your advice. I didn't make a declaration, a personal declaration, at the beginning of the meeting, but I have on my full record a full declaration that my son works for Surrey County Council, and I just feel an openness as I've waited for this item. Maybe I should mention it now. Sadly, it's not a remunerative thing that I receive from him, but he is independent with his own home, but I feel it would be nice just to mention it.
I think that's very wise, Mrs. Lake, and I'll ask the monitoring officer to note that accordingly. Thank you. There's no other comment. The recommendation is... Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. If we've had one declaration, I think we should have another. My daughter also works for Surrey County Council.
Any advance on two? Mr. Witham.
Yeah.
I feel like an auctioneer.
I have a stepdaughter who works for Surrey.
3 strikes and we're out. Thank you. So the recommendation is that Council agrees the pay policy statement for 2019-20. Are we agreed? Thank you. Moving to item 10. Thriving community of children and young people in Surrey, a strategy for their emotional well-being and mental health. Leader, would you introduce the report?
Thank you, Chairman. This is a really important strategy and sits within the overall Surrey Health Plan that was recently published and is out for public engagement. Mental health issues and general emotional well-being are key areas of focus within that plan, and indeed a key part of our 2030 vision to make sure that no one is left behind. As we know, sadly, mental health increasingly affects every generation, and you can see from the statistics the impact of that. So this strategy focuses on early intervention and community support, collaborative working, as well as good, timely communication with children, young people and parents, and indeed they have contributed to this strategy. Chairman, it's a working document, but I believe will provide a very strong foundation to build on as we learn more about how to help the younger generation. We will put in place mechanisms to monitor the impact of this strategy, and you'll see on pages 73 and 74 some of those measurements, and we will ensure that this is regularly reviewed at the Health and Wellbeing Board. And on that basis, again, Mr. Chairman, I commend this policy to members.
Thank you, Leader. Mrs. Curran.
Thank you, Chairman. Members in this chamber have heard me speak on many occasions about the importance that I personally put upon the good emotional well-being and good mental health of our children and young people. But I am really, really pleased that the leader has brought this vision document to full council today. And I think it really shows the importance, the prominence and the priority that it is being given by this council. And I think all members here today would join me in thanking him for bringing it to us. I think it's also indicative of the fact that increasingly issues around mental health are being spoken about publicly, that secrecy around our mental health is being dispelled, and the stigma that many people feel that when they have mental health issues is being set aside. Secondly, and I wanted to go back to some of the debate that we had earlier today that Mr. Kington was talking about when he was referring to the old approach to partnership. I am really pleased when I read this document that it is a joint production of an enormous number of different agencies and different people and different partners. I was at one of the launch partnership event when we heard from Freya personally, and Freya's story is in this document, and that young woman, a remarkable young woman, was there speaking about her journey. But this is really a partnership document from so many people. But the key issue is that it's absolutely clearly driven by the voice and the experience of children, young people and families themselves. And I really think that differentiates it from anything that's ever gone before. And finally, Chairman, I did want to say this is a really great vision and an ambition for what we want for mental health services for our children and young people. We want them, as Mr. Botton said earlier, to get the service that they are entitled to and that they need. We want the right service at the right time, and my only prayer is that this goes on to actually deliver a service that we can all be proud of. Thank you, Chairman.
Dr. Povey.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I absolutely endorse what Mrs. Curran has just said, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I just felt I wanted to raise one cautionary note that in paragraph 232, it refers to the 15 strategies and plans on which this one is based. And that worries me a little bit. It reminds me of when David Blunkett was Secretary of State for Education, and we had 17 different educational plans all at the same time. And I think we just must be cautious in terms of what we do, that we want to spend money, in this case, on children, on their well-being. We don't want endless committees and plans that are then going to use staff to review and to monitor and all the rest. So, wonderful document. I endorse utterly what Mrs. Curran has said, but let's just be careful about just how many different plans and strategies we actually produce.
Mrs. Lewis.
Thank you. It's already been mentioned today the importance of talking to children and young people about the kind of services that they would use and which they would benefit from. And I think it's important for us all to note that at the front of this document is a children and young persons charter, which shows just how key they are in all this decision making. I would like to give some reassurance to Dr. Povey, because as in other aspects of the children's services improvement work, we're looking at evidence of what works elsewhere, and this the Thrive framework is a nationally recognised framework which has been successfully implemented elsewhere and has had very beneficial results. So it's not something that we're inventing as an excuse for having another range of committees and so on. It was very pleasing to see how much this was welcomed when it went through the Health and Wellbeing Board by our partners. There was really positive feeling behind it. As Claire Curran says, it's taking us to where we want to be, which is away from a medicalised model of care for children's emotional well-being and their mental health, and to something that's much nearer to home, based in the community, in schools and colleges. And one aspect that hasn't been spoken about yet, amongst many positive aspects, is as part of this strategy,
what is proposed is a team around the key worker. So in other words, it could be somebody in a school, somebody in a youth club, somebody in Guides and Scouts who is the right person to talk to this young person, but around that key person there will be a team of experts that they can tap into so that they get the support they need in doing the work and delivering it where the child or young person actually is and where they want to talk to people. So I commend this new strategy to the Council because I think it takes us a long way forward in providing the help that we've been told by children and young people they are concerned to have. When the Youth Cabinet recently presented the results of their vote to us, 18,000 children and young people in Surrey voted, and they said mental health issues were at the very top of their agenda of what was most important to them, and this is a response to what they've told us is important in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lewis. Mr. Botton.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I thoroughly endorse this strategy. I read it to someone who's used mental health services for most of his life and started out when I was 11 years old. And I read this with some envy. When I was 11, there wasn't Facebook bullying me and calling me names. There wasn't the fear of knife crime. My family was stable, yet I still suffered. Children today have all those further challenges to have to deal with. And now more than ever, we need a strategy which sets out a direction of travel to support them, to nurture them, to make them safe, and to make them resilient. The Thrive programme, on which features prominently in this document, is one which I know works extremely well with vulnerable children in our primary schools. Those with which I've been associated have used it with immense success. And the way in which it focuses the work of teachers and Thrive practitioners in supporting children to make them more resilient, it can be transformatory. What I would say about this strategy is that if you look at page 59, it's clear that of the 4 boxes there in terms of the transformation programme, the strategy is box 2. So what I want to do is to pledge myself today to turn this pledge into a contract which delivers the promise of well-being to our children, because that's what they deserve. This is a county council which, in my view, has done as much as it could to eliminate the stigma that's associated with mental health, which is why I feel safe to stand up and make the disclosure that I have done, and done so in the past. I'm proud of that, and I'm also proud that this document will provide a fundamental and sound basis to go forward to protect the most vulnerable people in our community. Chairman, I welcome this strategy and commend it to the Chamber.
Mrs. Muir.
I too very much welcome this document. It's a subject very close to my heart, and I seem to bring up early intervention every opportunity I do when I stand in this chamber, and it's great to me to see this column, and I love this statement, that it is so much better to build a fence at the top of the cliff than run an ambulance service at the bottom. And the other fact that I'm so happy to see is we will focus on supporting children to support themselves. I've worked very closely firsthand, particularly with young adults and adults who have suffered from not being enabled in this way. It is a social travesty in the past that hasn't been the case. If somebody, for instance, suffers from autism, they are damned or have been damned for the rest of their lives. So this is the most wonderful programme, and I sincerely hope that we can see young people in the future who've benefited from this to become productive young adults for whom their families, carers and communities can benefit from all of this.
Mr. Harrison.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to also support the policy and practice here, but ask a couple of questions. It's interesting, the example Lady Freya talks about 8 months to get help. The Charter says that accessing help quickly is important and support as soon as I need it is used. And clearly the figure in figure 6 is helpful to show how things develop from a low level, and I think what has changed the last few years is the involvement of schools in these matters. My questions really are, I think when this came to the Children's Improvement Board, we were very surprised how poor the CAM service was delivering. There's not very much mention of the CAM service. I'd like to understand where that now stands, what the backlog in dealing with cases is, and it's mentioned that access to services remains challenging, and to ask what is being done about that in terms of funding and the CAMS contract. If the portfolio holder could help me, that would be helpful to me. Thank you.
Leader, will you select one of your cabinet to come back, or would you like to take it elsewhere?
In all areas of that, we recognise the importance of early intervention, and we have recognised that we have some work to do with the CAMS service. It was something that was looked at by Children Education Select Committee when we last met. There are plans in place with the transformation, and I'd be happy to give you any further detail after this meeting.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Darby.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amazing enough, this morning, I think a great likelihood of unanimity across the chamber. I too visited Woking when Freya spoke. It was an absolute privilege, inspirational, and I just really commend everyone to read that section if they haven't already. Taking some points from it, she saw the GP for 3 minutes, referred me to a website which she said wasn't very good. Not a great start. Too right, it wasn't. That's a really key point. The second one, which she takes it further, her teacher gets involved, a fantastic teacher, clearly. She goes on a waiting list 8 months. Mr. Harrison has already mentioned that. Those sorts of delays are not early intervention, and it is absolutely essential that that happens. Moving on, in her summary, effectively, showing empathy. Again, she spoke brilliantly about that. It's not difficult to show empathy. It costs nothing. I think there's a training issue there, perhaps less costly but really important, and as various of our members have said just now, across the chamber, early intervention is absolutely essential. We do appear to have significantly more money now from government for mental health services all round. It's essential that we make the best use of it. It's not just listening to our young children and young people. That's very, very important, but it's actually the actions, not words. Training of GPs, training in schools, more money perhaps to schools to be able to do that. And also a very important issue, because although not mentioned here, Freya did mention it, the transition from young people to adults is also essential. And again, if everyone hasn't read the various sections, those on pages 73 and 75 are very good reading. I thoroughly commend this report.
Thank you, Mr. Darby. Excellent debate. And the recommendation is that the strategy is approved. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Item 11, report of the Cabinet, page 81 of the agenda. Call the leader to present the report of the meeting of the Cabinet held on 26th February 2019.
Thank you, Chairman. I do so that I present the report of the Cabinet held on the 26th of January 2019.
Thank you. I call paragraph A. Any questions? Paragraph B. Yes, Mr. Robert Evans.
I just wonder if there's any update on the paragraph B. How's it going?
Sadly, the Cabinet member responsible for Brexit is hospitalised. Nothing to do with Brexit, I don't think. But our preparations continue. It's getting at the right balance between doing too much and not enough. We all know what the national position is, but I think we will be as well, which is uncertain. But we will be as prepared as we can be when we know what's going to happen.
Thank you, Leader. So the motion is that the report of the meetings of the Cabinet held on 26 February 2019 be adopted. Is that agreed? Agreed. And item 13, Cabinet minutes. No notification of question on the minutes has been received, so the meeting ends at 12:55. Thank you.